All right, welcome to folks coming in. Everyone's getting connected to their audio and joining from the waiting room. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you for joining us for the second annual Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. My name is Chelsea Ross. I'm the Deputy Director for the Partnership for Strong Communities. And I have Kaylee Pratt, who's a Senior Policy Analyst with Partnership for Strong Communities, and Exxon Baladimai from Partnership as well, here to support this session. This year, the Partnership for Strong Communities is hosting 3 days of sessions featuring local, state, and national experts, leading conversations that explore challenges, share best practices, and coalesce us around the critical next steps to address the key affordable housing issues in our state. You can join in on the conversation at hashtag CAHC 2021 on Twitter, and follow us at PSC Housing if you aren't already. And this session is entitled Tenants Right to Legal Counsel and Evictions. And before we turn it over to our presenters, I'd just like to thank our leading sponsors, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and the Melville Charitable Trust. Their deep support has allowed this conference to happen again this year. And thank you to our collaborating sponsors, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Webster Bank, and Rockport Mortgage. We also have an armful of supporting sponsors that have helped make this conference happen, including Beacon Communities, Capital for Change, Corporation for Supportive Housing, Elm City Communities, Fairfield County Community Foundation, Federal Home Loan Bank of Boston, JHM Group, LISC, National Equity Fund, and Trinity Financial. And last but not least, a big thank you to the sponsor for this session, Connecticut Voices for Children. A few housekeeping items. The session is being recorded and we'll make all recordings available to conference attendees as soon as possible. We're shooting for next week. The session is also being broadcast on CTN. All participants have been entered muted. Please remain on mute unless the speaker has asked you to unmute. If you have any tech issues, please use the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and send the chat to Chelsea Ross at PSC Zoom meetings, and I will do my best to assist you. And your speakers today will let you know how they'd like questions to be submitted either via chat or coming off mute. And with that, I will turn it over to Melissa to get us started.
Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to share my screen. Great. So my name is Melissa Marichal, and I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And I'm joined today by 4 other panelists, Sarah White, who is also at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, Justin Farmer, who is a Hamden City Councilman, and Luke Melonakos-Harrison, who is a tenant organizer with the Central Connecticut DSA, as well as Natalie Wagner, who is Executive Director of the Connecticut Bar Foundation. So today we're going to be talking about the state of Connecticut's new right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. I'm just going to go over really briefly what our agenda is today. We are going to cover the basics of what is a right to counsel. Then we're going to focus on talking about the campaign for tenants' right to counsel, why we pushed for that in Connecticut, the coalition that formed around that push, how that win was achieved, and then we're going to move on to looking at what implementation looks like and what comes next. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will try to get to all of them at the end of the presentation. So thank you again, and I will pass it on to Sarah White.
Hi everyone, my name is Sarah White. I'm also an attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center, and I was one of the many folks who pushed for right to counsel and won it in the spring as part of the Right to Counsel Coalition, which included the Fair Housing Center, DSA, folks from all the legal aid agencies, the folks from the labor movement, community organizations, tenant organizers, tenants, so many people pushing for this huge change to Connecticut's laws that's going to make an enormous difference for tenants. So just to give people a little bit of context about what is right to counsel. So I think as many folks know, in a criminal case, when someone is facing jail time, they are guaranteed the right to a lawyer, constitutionally guaranteed the right to a lawyer to represent them if they can't afford one. What a lot of folks, maybe don't realize though, is then that most other types of cases, civil cases, there isn't a right to a lawyer if someone can't afford one. And that includes, cases where someone's basic rights are at stake. So housing, so something like an eviction, something involving child custody and, access to your children, things like that. And so what the right to counsel movement, or sometimes it's called Civil Gideon, refers to is trying, typically legislatively, but sometimes through constitutional challenges, to expand people's right to a lawyer in all sorts of cases where serious issues affecting, their basic rights, their livelihood are at stake. And so, that includes, a movement that's nationwide to enact state or local legislation to give tenants a right to a lawyer in eviction cases, since their housing and so much else is at stake there. And as we know, and I think folks heard earlier in the previous panels, evictions have so many ripple effects. So a great resource to learn more about this nationwide movement is the National Coalition for Civil Right to Counsel, and we've put their website up there too. And they have really been, leaders in helping provide support to the right to counsel movement and have a lot of great information there too. But, right to counsel in the last 3 years, at least for tenants, has really grown a lot. And we now have, 3 states, including Connecticut, that have a right to counsel for tenants facing eviction. And I keep losing track now, but I think we're up to 13 cities as well, which included New York, which was the first, but there's many others at this point. Louisville, San Francisco, Philadelphia, Baltimore, many more. So what we won in Connecticut, just so folks have a little context going into the rest of the presentation, which is going to be more about the campaign and how we won this. We passed a law that creates a statewide right to counsel program for income eligible tenants, which is defined as 80% of state median income, which is subject to funding. But we did also win $20 million through federal coronavirus relief funds to seed the program for the first 2 years to help roll it out. And what representation means here is, a lawyer representing the tenant through the eviction process, which folks generally face, tenants face without a lawyer. 80% of landlords have lawyers, like less than 7% of tenants do, which puts them at a steep advantage, even though so much is more at stake for tenants. Their housing, their family security, things like that versus, essentially rent and profit. So that's a little bit about, what right to counsel is and what we won here. And I'm going to pass it off to Justin to talk a little bit about why we decided to push for right to counsel and why it's so important.
Thank you. I just first want to thank so many of the community partners like Cecil and Ralphie, legislators like Representative Porter, Michelle, Senator Lopes, Senator Winfield, and so many more, the BPRC, right? So I'm Justin Farmer. I am a city councilor in Hamden, and I want to share with y'all why right to counsel is so important to me and kind of how we got here fighting for the right to counsel. My family is originally from Jamaica. I happen to be the only American born. And so when my family first immigrated here, they spent a great deal of time migrating between different rental properties. Oftentimes, my mother happens to be a single parent of 5. And oftentimes, she would get run around from landlords. Sometimes things would get neglected. And so, it was really her making a conscientious effort of where we would live. All the time I hear my mother's voice in my head, right? The most important thing is roof over your head. And even if you have sleep under tree, right? And so I know that the most important thing, right, is having stable housing, right? From housing, we're able to figure out how we're going to have food. We can figure out how to rest our body. We can figure out what our dreams and aspirations are. And so right to counsel for me really starts there, right? And so 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago now, me and a couple of colleagues, we went around knocking on doors, talking to community members about their housing conditions. And I remember this one Middle Eastern man who we knocked on his door. He was helping to raise his grandchildren as well as preteens that he had. And I remember I went up to his door, knocked on his door. His door is rusty, almost fallen off. And we asked him how was his living condition? Did his landlord treat him right? Was everything okay? And it was really, really sweet. And oh, everything's good, everything's fine. And we kind of pushed him because we could see distress around him. He said, "Well, things are fine, but the back door to our home is broken, and we've been reaching out to the landlord for a couple of weeks, and nothing's really happened." It's like, oh, okay, that's a huge deal, right? Like we should figure out what to do about that. And we kept chatting. He's like, something else that's bothering me. The basement, all the windows have been blown out, and so there's vermin that keep getting into the basement. That's kind of annoying. And we kept talking, and he's like, I don't want to complain, but I don't want to get in trouble. But we haven't had hot water in a week, and as we kept talking with this man and learning the full scope of all these issues, I think several of us realized that without communicating with tenants directly and without them feeling that they can advocate for themselves without reprisal, that community members will live in conditions that no one should, right? And so, thankfully, we were able to get that man some help. But I never forget that story, and I never forget, him kind of coming to us, or rather, we coming to him, and then him sharing with us kind of his concerns. So, the negative impacts of eviction, right? We right here on the slides, we can see them, right? 80% of landlords have legal representation, right, in our state. Only 7% of tenants. 7% of tenants, right? A fraction of landlords, right? We know that when we invest in families, when we invest in communities, when we invest in people's housing, right, $1 towards right to counsel saves anywhere between $2.40 to $12.74, right? And we can leverage those cost savings to SNAP benefits or to other programming, after school program, right? There's so many other things that we could do with those funds that we look forward to in the rollout of right to counsel, right? Black and Latinx community members are twice as likely to be evicted compared to their white compatriots, right? And so, in my community of Hampton, where 46% of community members are renters, and next to the neighborhood that I represent in New Haven, right? 83% of community members are renters, right? We're talking about large amounts of people in our state that are facing these difficulties, right? Women are 1.4 times likely to face eviction, and more so if it's women of color. And we know that these consequences affect everything from mental health, from stressing on bills to access to education, right? Especially when they're moving around often, figuring out where to get services for your family, right? We know it affects things like transportation, right? Being able to live in a place that is accessible and allows you opportunities, both recreational, but as well as financially, right? When the average community member in the New Haven area travels about 4 to 5 miles to get to work, right? And so I list all of these things, I share all of these things because for me, we took that advocacy from knocking on doors, talking to community members, and then I happened to run for Senate, right? And so we came up with a ton of policies talking about social housing, and we know that the real issue is that we need to decommodify housing, right? And unfortunately, it did not win, right? Senator Cabrera, right, is doing a great job. But out of that came the legislative session in the winter, right? And as we had been dealing with COVID and we had been organizing around housing issues and tenant issues, we decided to push on right to counsel, right? And so I'll leave y'all with one more story, right? We had advocated and talked to legislators and pushed and talked about ideas for what the legislation would be. And you know, we came to this point where we learned of a mother who had 2 kids, right? And it was the winter and there was snow on the ground. And so much so, right? I can think of my family, I can think of my brothers and sisters as young children, right? And I could picture my mother when I was seeing this mom, right? And she was facing eviction because she was behind and rent only 2 months, right? When we had a global pandemic and everything had fundamentally changed, she was only behind in rent for 2 months, right? And marshals were called, right? And she faced the chance of being evicted and having her stuff thrown out in the snow with her young children, figuring out where would she be housed, where would she live, right? And so all that to say, right, right to counsel is so much more than simple legislation, right? It doesn't fix the problem, but it allows us to give ourselves more time and to be more compassionate and more thoughtful about how we as legislators, as we as community members, as we as advocates, think about how we demonstrably change housing and what we need to do next. And so I'm going to pass it off, right, to talk about some of the things that we need to think about and do next.
Thank you, Justin. My name is Luke. I'm a tenant organizer with the Central Connecticut Chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America. I worked on the Right to Counsel campaign and have been working on tenant organizing since then. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what our campaign really looked like, what it took to pass this bill, and how that fits into a larger movement for tenants' rights and tenants' power in Connecticut. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so, you know, it was December of last year, 2020, our group of tenant organizers was looking around in the middle of the second wave of COVID during lockdown, looking at the stats that were coming out about the number of evictions that could be expected during this pandemic, and just really trying to figure out what to do. And we were also looking at the general status quo of housing that Justin was just describing, about how this fundamental human need and human right to shelter is so precarious for so many people. And the power discrepancy between landlords and tenants is so wide. And so we were looking around, kind of trying to figure out what to do. And we looked to our neighbors in New York City and saw what they had done with their Right to Legal Counsel campaign in 2016, and how that they had successfully passed that at a city level and had results to show for it. They had demonstrated its effectiveness in reducing evictions by like 75%. They had shown the cost effectiveness of, you know, how much money the city saves on preventing homelessness rather than addressing it and punishing it after the fact. And they had published this toolkit of how to launch your own Right to Counsel campaign. And so we were inspired by that and decided that in the middle of the pandemic, this was the time to move. we knew that this was a really ambitious campaign. It was December, the legislative session was about to open at the state level. At that time, a right to counsel law for eviction had not been passed at the state level anywhere in the country. So we were innovating, but we just decided to go for it. And part of the rationale was, even if we thought at the time, even if we don't get this law passed this time around, number one, we have to do something with the way that evictions are looking during this pandemic. We just have to do something. And number two, even if it doesn't pass, this can be a way to get grassroots organizing going for tenants. It's kind of something to rally around, something to build a coalition around, something to organize around, so that even if it doesn't pass the first time, we will be building a structure, an organization, a movement that we can build on in the future for the next battle or the next legislative session. So that was our mentality going into it in December, and we kind of just took off a big bite, and we're amazed and so grateful that it actually paid off in the end. And one thing I'll say is, in a lot of other situations where the civil right to counsel that Sarah was talking about, in other cases beyond just eviction, a lot of those efforts have been largely driven by the legal community, whether legal non-service or legal nonprofit service organizations, pro bono, legal academics, other groups within the legal community. What was different about our campaign and what we were inspired by from New York was a tenant-led campaign coming from people with lived experience of housing precarity and eviction, speaking from personal experience, and organizing tenants to fight for right to counsel as a way to improve their own conditions at a grassroots level, rather than coming from the legal community. So that really characterized our organizing as well, was bringing tenants and sort of using this right to counsel campaign as a way to get tenants talking to each other about their shared issues. Yeah, so next slide. In that spirit of a grassroots campaign, we got out and got all over the place. I mean, we started with a petition that circulated online. We started reaching out to like-minded organizations and building our coalition. We did a lot of educational events on Facebook Live and Zoom. Again, it was during the lockdown, so we were just doing a lot of stuff online. But that actually was helpful because we got people from all over the state involved. We also did go door to door and just pass out materials and talk to people on the doors about their experience with being threatened by eviction or facing housing precarity during the pandemic. We did phone banks. We just got people to hop on a Zoom call and call the representative and talk about why right to counsel was important altogether. We did a lot of op-eds. I got to write about an op-ed about what right to counsel means for the LGBT community. And a lot of our other organizers got op-eds published, about right to counsel is important for their community. And so it was just an incredibly fast-paced and aggressive campaign. We were working on a really short timeline, but I think the momentum was there because it spoke to people, because people were seeing the situation of, people and families losing their homes in a pandemic, horrible during any circumstance, but particularly during a pandemic. And so the energy was just really there, and tons of people pitched in and made it possible. Next slide. One moment from the campaign that I'll speak to, just an anecdote that stands out to me, was when we had our public hearing before the legislature, Connecticut State Legislature, on March 4th. Myself included, and many of the other organizers of this had not participated in a legislative campaign like this before, and had not spoken at a public hearing. And so it was all new for me and for a lot of us. But we did a training beforehand to coach people how to speak at a public hearing, how to be concise, get your point across, how to submit written testimony. So we did that. And then on the day of the public hearing, we had dozens of people submit written testimony and then sit on this Zoom call for hours and hours waiting for their turn. And people were willing to do that because, again, they were speaking from their personal experience. And they were just really speaking from the heart about what right to counsel in many cases, what it would have meant to them if they had had it when they or their family was facing eviction. And in other cases, it was, the difference that having access to a lawyer through legal aid or something like that did make for them in fighting their eviction case. So that moment of seeing so many people speak up about what right to counsel meant to them, and again, being led by tenants, not by lawyers, not by advocates, but by tenants themselves speaking from their own experience, was just incredibly powerful. So, right to counsel for us is one part of a larger movement to increase tenant protections, to decrease the power discrepancy between landlords and tenants that I was speaking to earlier. And we've seen this play out. So the Right to Counsel Coalition brought together a lot of organizations that have been continuing to communicate. And it was also a rallying point, like I said, for a lot of tenants. So since then, we've been building on that and have started organizing tenants at properties to form tenants unions and discover the power that they have looking towards each other to build strength. And, as Justin was saying, the thing about not having a right to counsel is that as a tenant, the roof over your head is at stake. I mean, just an extremely basic fundamental need is on the line. And so if a landlord is neglecting repairs for months or even years at a time, is acting abusively or in a discriminatory fashion, if they're just raising the rent consistently year after year while your income is not changing at all, or in the case of the pandemic, for many of us going down, there's no recourse. The threat of eviction hangs over your head, because if you risk fighting back, you very well could be losing your shelter. And so having a right to counsel in place is just an extra layer of protection for tenants to have a little bit more breathing room to fight for their rights and for the enforcement of their rights, without having such a thin layer of protection to where they could lose their housing for even fighting back. And the threat of eviction is used so often to keep tenants in unacceptable conditions. And so getting this law passed has been a part of our broader effort to organize tenants and educate them about their rights and have them sort of turn towards each other and discover their shared issues to fight back and fight for the enforcement of housing code that so often goes unenforced. And, just fight for basic respect and dignity as tenants without having such an acute fear of losing their homes. So I would say that's sort of the heart of our organizing, is the grassroots level of empowering tenants to speak for themselves and, getting organized to increase tenant power and have more control over housing and not be in such a fundamentally precarious position. So for us, Right to Counsel is part of a broader movement of addressing housing affordability, housing security, climate resiliency, and overall the battle against poverty. And I'll pass it back to Natalie.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, my speaker is going a little in and out, so hopefully this will go okay. So I'm Natalie Wagner. I'm from the Connecticut Bar Foundation, and we are what is called the administering entity for the Connecticut Right to Counsel program. And we were chosen by the judicial branch to play this role in the implementation. Administering entity is something that's actually defined in the statute. And it essentially means that we're funding the program, but we're helping also to figure out how all the players work together. So just going to go through explaining a little bit about the challenges, how we've, some of the things that we're focusing on in the implementation, just to provide a better context to what everyone can expect going forward. So this program, because it's really only the second program in the country that's going to be phased in on a statewide basis. So one of the speakers mentioned previously that we were the third state to enact Right to Counsel. the other two states being Washington State and Maryland. So far, Washington State has already started their implementation process, and Maryland is in the process of, similar to where we are, to planning their implementation, but they're also looking for funding. Thankfully, as was also mentioned, we do have some funding to get started, which puts us in a great position. So we have had to figure out, well, how do we use that funding to get as much done as we possibly can in the 2 years that we have that funding? And to roll something out on a statewide basis, as you can imagine, covers a lot of challenges that on a local level, when something is being rolled out, just aren't really the same. Despite the fact that, let's say, New York City has by far, way more eviction filings than we do in the state of Connecticut, right? So it's interesting to compare a quite large local jurisdiction to a state-wide effort that is smaller, but still has additional administrative burdens. And one of those, as you can imagine, is that things in Connecticut tend to happen on a local basis. That's sort of a hallmark of Connecticut. And so working in a lot of different municipalities can be tricky. But one of the things that we did decide to do sort of off the bat was to do a geographic prioritization. We can certainly identify filing rates and other characteristics based on geographic characteristics of a municipality or of a zip code, which is what we ended up with. So that's one of the reasons why we chose geographic distribution for the phase-in. The other aspect of it is staffing, right? Staffing is a really big part of implementation. And so when we're looking at the zip codes for trying to figure out where is this geographically going to be phased in, we also have to look at how can we staff this in those places? How do we get people to work in those places? How do we get them properly supported, properly supervised, especially if they're newer attorneys? And so these are all things that we're grappling with at the moment. And so we are working with nonprofit legal service organizations that are already providing these services throughout the state so that they already have the infrastructure in place. And they also have supervising attorneys that have been doing this work for quite a number of years now. In Connecticut, we're blessed with the fact that those who do housing work in Connecticut have done it for a long time because in many ways, they're actually architects of the law that we have currently protecting tenants. And so, we're sort of drawing on the strengths of those folks that have already been doing this work to try and expand the number of people we have to provide these services. We are also very concerned with the fact that the funding that has been made available for this is limited in term, right? It's not a state appropriation, which in and of itself carries some inherent limitations because the state budget is only a 2-year budget. But at this point, the stake in the game is really federal funding, and it's tied to the COVID relief efforts. And so that has been allocated to us for just the first 2 years of the program. And so one of the things that we felt was very important in the implementation of this program is to be able to demonstrate the value of this program here in Connecticut. So some of the speakers before me really talked about the value that has been demonstrated in other jurisdictions. And so we can use some of that information as well to make the case, as was done so well when the legislation was being pushed. But here, now that we're going to actually bring it into Connecticut, we felt it was really necessary to be able to have a strong independent evaluation to be able to show what are the benefits that are brought to the tenants, to the communities, to the state of implementing this kind of a program. And the councilman really described very well that the benefits to the tenant are not really just that you get a roof over your head and that you have stability, but that has a lot of ripple effects on other parts of your life, whether it be, health, access to healthcare, access to employment, access to childcare, access to education. There's so many things that really are tied to housing and your ability to be stable in your community. And so those are the things that we really want to be able to make sure that we're showing. And so as it says on the slide, we did an RFP to develop or to really identify an evaluator we thought would be a strong partner to be able to demonstrate that. And we found Stout, which we already knew about. And anyone, if you just do a quick Google search of, say, the cost benefit analyses of right to counsel programs, you'll find a lot of reports that Stout puts out around the country in varying jurisdictions, demonstrating what these programs can really do. And one of the things that's interesting about the reports that you'll find is that most of them are being used in advocacy, right? So most of them are reports from jurisdictions that are trying to pass right to counsel. And so they're showing the promise of the program. And here will be one of the first places to really be able to demonstrate what are we actually seeing as a result of implementing it. And so that's why we felt it was extremely important to be able to show what those things are. All right, you can go ahead. Is it working? Oh, there we are. Thanks, Melissa. Okay. So another peculiarity of where we find ourselves at the moment is that the bill was passed sometime last spring, and then it was signed by the governor in June and technically went to effect in July. But there was some space built into that for the fact that we had to build up the program. And as of October 1st, there was a notice that was having to go out to all tenants to notify them about the program. But we, as the Connecticut Bar Foundation, hadn't even yet, by that point, or just a few days before that, were chosen as the administering entity. And so here we were, we had October 1st coming, and this notice was going out to all the tenants, and there was no program yet because there was nobody to administer, nobody had been chosen to administer the program yet. So we were in this sort of precarious position. And so a notice did go out to all tenants, as was required by the statute, letting them know that this program is coming. And so now we're spending all this time in the interim making sure that we get it in place, so that, and we notified tenants in that notice as well that, we're hoping to get these services being provided as of January of 2022. So that's still our goal. And so to qualify for the program, there's really three things that have to happen, or that can happen. One of the three, which is that you have a notice to quit in your hand, which if you're getting the notice, this notice to tenants also means that you have a notice to quit because they're coming to you, or they should be coming to you at the same time. Also, if you're getting a summary process summons from the judicial branch saying that you need to come to court because an eviction has been filed against you, you also will be getting this notice of this program. And then in addition to that, if you're getting a notice saying that a housing subsidy is being terminated and you're going to have an administrative hearing on that, you'll also become notified of this program. So built in to the statute is this notice requirement. And so in terms of letting people know that this is available to them, that's the way we're going to do it. Now, there's a lot of other things that need to be done for this outreach, so that people really trust that this program is available to them for a couple of different reasons. Everybody that gets, certainly if you're getting something from the court telling you, that you have an eviction proceeding against you, you might not trust that something else that you're getting in the mail along with that is there to help you, right? So there's a lot of trust that needs to be built up that this is there to in fact help you. And so we're going to have to be doing outreach to the community, partnering with community organizations to make sure that that's coming from a voice that they trust. And in addition to that, because we're phasing it in by geographic location, we're going to have to make sure that we're providing information in a way that's clear enough to people so that those people that actually qualify because it's in their jurisdiction are the ones, that are expecting to be able to provide the service. Because the last thing that we want to do is to provide people, with the sense that they're going to get the service when we do not yet have lawyers available to provide it to them. Last thing we want to do is provide somebody in crisis with an undue sense that they're going to get something that we don't have available to them. And so that's what we're really, one of the other things that we're focusing on right now is being very clear in our intention and what we're going to be able to provide people so that we can explain that clearly to people. And we're going to do that in two ways, most likely. One is a website, and one is a call-in number, both of which will be provided on the notice. They're currently there already, that they can call into to find out, does my zip code qualify? Do I live somewhere where this program is currently operating? So that they can know right away and don't have to sit on the phone for too long. And then as we expand the program, those zip codes will be added so that as soon as you call, you'll know. We felt like that was really important to be able to clearly articulate to people. So the notice itself that's currently up there, you can find at the website that is provided on the slide. And that's just the notice that is saying that this is coming, that the law passed. We're currently getting this up and running. And this is the spot, this is the tools that you can use in order to find out if you qualify, if it's being rolled out in your area, and how to find that out. And then in addition to that, on the notice, we've provided other things that people can take advantage of. So for right now in Connecticut, we do have something called CT Law Help. And that's something that provides information to really anybody who wants it about their rights, whether it's to housing or other areas of the law. And also how to reach out to legal services in Connecticut to find out if they currently qualify for services. And one of the distinctions to Right to Counsel that also heavily informed how we're deciding the implementation is that the way that things currently work is it's essentially like playing the lottery if you're trying to get a legal service attorney, because we have a scarcity of funding available to provide free legal services to people who are eligible based on their income. And something that's supposed to be very different about Right to Counsel is that if you qualify, you should be getting counsel. And so while it's hard, sorry, I'm losing my voice. While it's difficult to roll out a program knowing that you can't provide it to everybody, we want to make sure that in those jurisdictions that we are providing it, that we can do that. And so that's why we're rolling it out by geographic location so that we can clearly articulate to people, if you are income eligible for this program and you have received a notice to quit, a summary process notice, or a notice of housing subsidy termination, and you live in one of these areas and you income qualify, that you will get legal assistance. And so that was another piece of it that we're just really trying to honor. So we've also provided the number, the website Eviction Help Connecticut. And that is where you can go. You'll still, I think at this point, you really just see the notice there as well, but that's the other place that people will be able to go to find out where the program is going to be rolled out, which geographic regions are currently being served, and what you need to know to qualify. And we'll have a lot more resources on there as well. Melissa, if you want to just go to the next slide. So these are the current providers that are hiring counsel to be able to provide these services in January. So if you know anybody who's interested in doing this work, please direct them to these three organizations because they are currently hiring. They're doing their recruitment process to make sure that people are on board, and they have to be trained as well. Even if they have experience in housing law, the Right to Counsel program will be somewhat different than what they've done before. So everyone will require some training. And so please do spread the word, because hiring is now the part that we just want to make sure we get as many attorneys hired as possible to be able to roll out the program as fast as possible and be able to get people services. So anyway, thank you so much to everybody who has taken time out of their day to be a part of this presentation, to listen to this presentation, and for the partnership for putting it on. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of it.
So what next? I am doing what next? No. I guess we are just in time. So I am going to, as a activist official, I am so much about action, right? And so I am going to put out a couple of actions for y'all, right? And throw it into the chat. And so there's a couple of different things that we want you to do, right? We want you to share your email or click the bit.ly link, right? I'm gonna also share with y'all the Facebook frame and the graphic that we have, right? I made it my profile picture for every single piece of social media. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, everything you see is encouraging people, educating people, informing people about the right to counsel and its rollout in January, right? And then lastly, right, making sure, as Natalie said, like we need to make sure that we are hiring lawyers, right? So if you know, all right, I'm gonna give you some common counsel right here, right? So if you know a counselor, right, in your life, right, or someone who has just finished law school, right, who wants to do this work, who's interested in this work, to share this information with them because it's so important. So I'm going to take a little bit of time with y'all. And so while I'm sharing a little quick perspective, I'm hoping y'all are clicking these links and that you are making these profiles, that you're sharing it with friends, that you're encouraging others. I kind of left y'all on a cliffhanger. That mother, right, that we saw in the snow, who was fighting to stay in her home, right? We were able to help her, right? Because of the organizing and the work that we were doing, right? But it was so much harder, and it was at the 11th hour because we didn't have a fail-safe like right to counsel, right? And so it was only because we were doing this organizing and that we were talking to people and that we were out on the ground that by happenstance we were able to be in community with this mother, right? But if it wasn't for these efforts, like so many other people, she could have lost her housing, right? And so this is why this work is so important, right? And we cannot do it without you, right? We got funding for 2 years, right? But housing is generational, right? We know that people are able to build wealth generationally by owning, right? Owning homes, but also being in stable housing. And so I'm imploring y'all, I'm asking y'all to take this time, share it with people, share it with friends, because it is so
Uh-oh, I think Justin froze. So I'll hop back in for a second. Hopefully Justin will unfreeze in a second. But like you said, I mean, just to reiterate, or so folks can hear it from another person, it's amazing that we run this law, this framework, and 2 years of funding, but it's going to be a fight and take a grassroots movement of tenants and their allies in the advocacy community and unions, like all over the place, in order for us to get the permanent funding we need to make this a continuing program that's available to all tenants everywhere in the state. So please do sign up for the Right to Counsel Coalition emails and get updates that way, and like spread the word about Right to Counsel too, so folks know that this is coming, and like please do share and use the social media graphics that that Justin was put in the chat for everybody. And it looks like we've got about like 10 minutes or so for questions. So I know that there was one question in the chat about where it's going to roll out first. It looks like Natalie has answered, and I'll just read her answer so folks have it. It's going to depend on how many attorneys can be hired, but those communities with the highest number and rate of evictions will be prioritized in this initial phase. And just to reiterate again, like ultimately we hope this will be a statewide program available to all tenants, but it's going to have to start as a rollout in some communities, and then spread throughout the state as we build experience and hopefully win that permanent funding. And then, if folks either want to drop some more questions in the chat for the presenters, or you could like raise your hand also and I'll call on you. And maybe while we're waiting for that, if my co-presenters have anything, they want to add, to emphasize something that wasn't covered, or maybe like a favorite moment from the campaign, which I know for me that there were many. Justin.
I hopefully, cross my fingers, knock on wood, I won't drop out this time. Just to expound on what Luke put in the chat, right? There's a power imbalance, right, between landlords and tenants, right? My family is luckily and blessed to be landlords now, right? And we think about, what we can do to be good stewards and be good community members. But we have to remember, right? There's tons of mom and pop landlords and there's tons of industrial landlords, right? And so I think it's important that we put that in perspective, but also, right, when we're taking out these erroneous evictions, right, and when we're allowing the legal system to do its job to sort out things, right? Sometimes it might not be that the person's not evicted, but it gives them vital months to be able to prepare to find housing, right? Sometimes it is figuring out where, as a landlord, right? There have been times where I've had tenants where I'm like, cool, fam, if we go to court, like, like you're gonna end up holding the bag, right? And I want to make sure I do right by you. So, right to counsel is a great equalizer, right? But also with those cost savings, right? We know that we have lead and old historic housing, right? We know that we need to do more around energy efficiency. And so we should look at this as an opportunity.
Oh no, Justin froze again, but we got pretty far, I think. So another question, and keep dropping them in the chat or raise your hand. Can people explain what services people get if they get a lawyer? Is it advice or legal representation? And I'll just quickly answer that. Right to counsel means legal representation. So a lawyer that is working with you, that is helping assess your case, advising you, doing paperwork for you, going to court with you, the whole thing. That is really at the core of what the right to counsel movement is fighting for. All right, I don't see any other questions. So we've got a few minutes, and I think it would be great if the presenters, shared a favorite moment from the campaign or something, they're looking forward to. And I'm going to start with Melissa, because we didn't get to hear much from her, but she was a huge part of the coalition and the effort to win this law.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you everyone for participating in the presentation. I think one of my favorite moments was the public hearing. I think that it was, I think others have mentioned earlier in the presentation, how powerful that was, and how it was a moment in the pandemic. It was remote, and traditionally a lot of these, public hearings it's not a lot of people who are actually impacted by the causes that are speaking. There's a high bar to entry, but like all this effort that we spent trying to get the word out about the public hearing, putting out a guide on how you can participate and submit testimony, it all came together, and it was really, really fun, really, to be a part of that day and to be in community with everyone. We had a group chat and we were sharing all our stories. And so I think that this work is hard, and eviction is hard. It's talking about someone's life being in crisis and their housing being on the line is a really heavy topic, and people sharing their stories is a really hard ask. But I think that being together and asking and fighting for this change is really special, and so that was one of my favorite moments. Sarah, do others want to share favorite moments or any other questions? Please raise your hand or drop your question in the chat. Natalie.
Yeah, I'll just say something quickly. Just sort of looking over the chat, I wanted to also emphasize the fact that in the evaluation progress, that we are bringing into the implementation process, I think tenant voices were so important, obviously, in passing right to counsel in Connecticut, and they'll also be important in the evaluation of the program. But I also wanted to mention that, landlord voices will need to be a part of it as well. And I think, the right to counsel program is about empowering tenant voices, because they are the ones without voices really in the legal system at this point. But we need it to work for everybody. And, recently in New York City, they had a landlord group come out in favor of the right to counsel program that they have there. And there are reasons for that. I mean, there are reasons why a landlord might want to, have their attorney talking, with another attorney, because it makes it less confrontational. And it doesn't have to be a confrontational thing. There is something in our legal system is set up as an adversarial system. But at the end of the day, we're talking about somebody's ability to have stable housing. And if it, just buys them extra time to find somewhere else if they don't want to be in that circumstance, not all tenants really want to stay in the circumstance that they're in. There are lots, it's a complicated issue. And so I just wanted to emphasize that it's there are a lot of voices that will be consulted throughout the process, and it's important because all those voices will be at the public hearing as well, right, when this comes up for funding in 2 years. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out as well.
Thanks, Natalie. Luke?
Yeah, thanks everyone. I just wanted to, remind everybody again to sign up to get on our list for continuing to fight for right to counsel and making sure that this is a permanent, fully funded program. And just really emphasize that as we close out our hour, and use those graphics and, show your support. Like I said, this was a grassroots campaign. This did not originate from a small group of experts. It did not come from just a small segment of people who are paying attention to this sort of esoteric issue. This really came from the bottom up of people looking around at our housing crisis and our housing situation in Connecticut and latching onto this as something that would be a material improvement and that would really improve people's lives. And so it bubbled up from the grassroots. And so we wanted to push forward with that same kind of momentum. So the little things like, changing your Facebook graphic or speaking about it with your friends, like that's how we got this law passed. We want to keep that momentum moving forward and have this be kind of part of our public discourse, and something that people are aware of, that this is a right that tenants know that they have. So please help us with that effort and spread the word. Thanks.
All right, I think we're going to end on that note. I put the form to sign up for emails in the chat, along with the links to the social media graphics. Thank you everyone so much for coming.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for hosting Partnership for Strong Communities. We really appreciate the space to talk about this. Thanks again, everyone.